Video, audio coming? Yeah, sounds good. All right. Usually my voice carries pretty well anyway. So good afternoon, everybody. I'm really excited to be here. This is my second DerbyCon, first time speaking here, and just very excited to be here. So a little bit about myself. I'm currently an enterprise security architect at Merck, the pharmaceutical company, not the shipping company. People tend to get us mixed up. I'm also an adjunct professor at the University of North Carolina at Charlotte. Because apparently I have additional spare time, I'm also a board member of an organization called ID Pro, which is focused on professional development for digital identity employees. I'm also an election precinct official, trying to keep our elections in a county in North Carolina secure. Hopefully it's obvious that the opinions expressed here are my own. I may tell some stories regarding my employer, but they're still my own opinion. And if you need to reach me, you can do so on Twitter. I will be publishing a copy of these slides on SlideShare a little while afterwards. So, as you can tell, there's another person or animal in that picture, and that's my girl Freckles. I've had her for about 10 years now. And so we're going to start off with a little bit of a horse story. Or rather, actually, it's going to be horses and security controls. A few years ago, I gave a talk that was inspired by an encounter with this lovely little lady. Her name is Pony. And she figured out that one of the gates that I thought I had locked, I did not. And she got out, and I found out in the worst possible way through a phone call from my wife, who heard from my neighbor. So, needless to say, that wasn't a good conversation, but as you can tell, everything went well and we made up. I came back this year from a trip to Europe, and I was ready to, re-engage with my horse and get moving, and this same gate jumped into the conversation, but for a different reason. I was working with her in the arena, and I asked her to do something that, as it turned out, sometimes horses have an opinion, and she decided she didn't want to do it. And her way of explaining that to me, because everything a horse tells you is feedback, she decided to jump that gate that I'm pointing at, or at least it appeared that she jumped the gate. Now, first of all, I had no idea my horse was that athletic, because if I did, I probably wouldn't have bought her, because I don't know that I want to ride that athletic of a horse. But I was more concerned because she was limping a little bit after she cleared into the pasture. And so naturally, I'm panicking. Like, I think I've broken my horse. I'm looking at this gate yet again, and I'm like, all right, that's it. We're putting up a wall. No one's ever getting through that section of fence ever again. But then after I had some time to calm down, she was fine. I kind of remembered some of my own learnings, both in software development and in security. And one of the first rules is you should seek to understand the problem. Now, part of it was, yes, her feedback. But what had really happened, and what you can see here in this example, was, as it turned out, the gate wasn't closed. My wife and I both were in the ring, and long story short, may have already failed that. There was a gap in between the gate that I couldn't see perceptively, and she jumped through that gap instead of doing what I was asking her to do, which frankly wasn't that onerous, but she decided otherwise, hence the expression here. So, in addition to understanding the problem, really what we should understand in that scenario is what the risk is. And that's really what we're going to be talking about today is under what circumstances is a wall required, and under what circumstances is something as mundane as this required. Ultimately, the risk should define the response. So what does this have to do with Modlishka and two-factor authentication? And more importantly, how do we react when new threat actors or new vulnerabilities come in? I'm going to target this contextually to two-factor authentication, but obviously there's lessons that can be applied to other vulnerabilities as well. And ultimately, as you saw in the story that I just told you, the idea of building a wall was a little bit of overkill. So when we first have that initial temptation to panic as a result of a security issue, the first thing we probably should do, just stop it. Couldn't resist inserting my friend Neil Patrick Harris there. He's not really my friend, I'm just a fan. So we're going to talk about three areas today. One is this concept that I've created, I think. I've been unable to find it on Google, so that means it's mine, right? Trademark office might disagree, but it's security panic theater. Then we're going to take a look at the current state of two-factor authentication, or what I will call it, the current state of authentication, and then we'll talk about what we do in terms of next steps. So with respect to security panic theater, everybody happy you probably attended Jason's talk. He talked about security theater, right? Everybody's pretty much familiar with that idea. You know, it's the idea that in spite of this mess getting created and everybody's being asked to do things that they probably shouldn't have to do, like take off their shoes because there might be a bomb in it. The reality is largely what they're doing. I think Jason had a slide up there that said 70% of the fake weapons that they tried to smuggle in actually got through. So, but I can't help but include this in the presentation because I think it just works to describe security theater too well. So if you bring in too much liquid, the TFA confiscates it and throws it away in case it's a bomb. So they throw it away in case it's a bomb in the garbage can right next to them with all the other possible bombs in the area with the most possible amount of people in case it's a bomb. I promise that's the last time I will read verbatim a slide. But that joke just works too well here. But what we're talking about with respect to security panic theater is the temptation, and the media is just as complicit as we can be sometimes. And as soon as we hear about a vulnerability, a 0-day, in this case, we're going to be talking about a pen testing toolkit called Modlishka. Our temptation is to go from 0 to 10 with respect to the level of panic that can ensue. And as we see in this headline that was written out, in full disclosure, I get it. Most of the folks that write these articles don't get to choose their headlines. Somebody wants something for clickbait, so I get that. Sometimes they get it right, sometimes they don't. But in this one, they clearly state, have we defeated two-factor authentication? First of all, I'm not sure that's even possible, and I'll tell you a little bit why in a moment. But, obviously it is a focus on the challenge. Modlishka does translate to Mantis. That's why I chose the term eating our lunch. But again, the idea should be, let's try and condition ourselves to not immediately going to 10 on the panic level when it comes to evaluating a new security issue. And to do this, we're going to take a historical view pretty quick. We're going to look at a crack of RSA. And when I say a historical view, it's really only the past few years. That's been what's kind of amazing with this journey is the amount of stuff that pops up almost in real time. I added 2 slides this week because of responses that took place, and I'll point out the ones when we get to them. We'll talk about SS7. We'll talk about SMS, of course. We'll talk about time-based one-time passwords. We'll talk about the Google security key flaw and YubiKey. And there's one more, I believe. So back in 2012, some security researchers, and this ARS technical headline is pretty fair, because this is what the researchers were reporting. We have hacked RSA's smart cards. If we have physical access to the device, okay, that's your first kind of caveat on what the actual risk is. And we have access to the key, we can extract the private keys off the device. That's what their claim was. RSA had kind of a different take, understandably so. Reading through the articles with respect to this, and all of these will be cited at the end of the deck, the reality was much more nuanced than what the security researchers were presenting. Next, with respect, I assume everybody's heard of SS7, the vulnerability on cell networks. Again, this is another scenario where, yeah, it's a real vulnerability, but you need physical access to the network in order to exploit it. And oftentimes, most of your average attackers don't have that. That doesn't mean it's not a vulnerability and it's not something you should respect. Certainly, financial institutions should pay very close attention to it. And it's another reason why SMS probably should be, we should be migrating away from it, but I don't know that we necessarily should kick it to the curb just yet. And then after that, last year, for those not familiar, NIST released an update to the 863 authentication standard. And one of the big things that got people's hair on fire was NIST officially deprecated SMS. And most people were like, good riddance. there's a lot of systems that still rely on SMS as a second factor of authentication. And yes, it's vulnerable, but it's still better than nothing. And so NIST had to actually print a retraction saying, look, we're not saying you don't use SMS ever. We're not recommending it as a method of two-factor authentication for out-of-band connectivity. So again, once you start digging behind and getting behind the panic or beyond the panic, you can find the truth. And then, of course, this week, many of you who are on Twitter, I'm sure, are aware that Jack Dorsey of Twitter had his account hacked. Now, originally, I owned some of the mud on my face for this. I assumed he got SIM jacked, which actually was true, and that they used that to bypass his two-factor authentication. That was not the case. They were exploiting an application authorization that would allow you to send text messages to an address that could serve as tweets. But the vulnerability is still there, and Twitter still allows you to use SMS as a method of two-factor authentication. They have two much stronger methods, either using application-based security for time-based or security keys, which definitely is, if you're not protecting your Twitter account with that, you should be. But anyway, that created, again, I wouldn't say quite a panic ensued as much as it was just a round bit of mocking, especially of the head of Twitter. So then we had earlier this year, Google revealed that their Titan security keys, some subsets of the ones that were produced, had a Bluetooth vulnerability. And again, so this kind of added to the chorus, and this was after Modlishka had already been announced. So those chorus of pundits were coming out saying, even the most secure one has a flaw in it, so we really probably shouldn't be using it, right? And the answer obviously was no. Number one, Google's going to replace the key. The keys are the strongest thing you can use out there. You should keep using it if you have it. And then, of course, my favorite one, because it's personal, YubiKey announced that some of their line of FIPS keys had a vulnerability, but it was a really kind of quirky vulnerability. If the user had already initialized the key, they had nothing to worry about. You actually had to not only have physical access to the key, but you also had to, the key had to be unregistered. And if you did that, then potentially you could exploit it. Obviously, YubiKey owned it very quickly, made an announcement, and they're replacing that line. Where it got personal for me is we use YubiKeys at Merck, not in as robust a fashion as I would like, but our incident response teams were pounding my inbox very quickly saying, do we need to do a recall? And I was like, guys, very simple email. We do not use the FIPS lines of YubiKeys. No further action is required. The good news was our incident response trusted that. So, again, seeing the panic ensue, and again, I didn't get any panicked phone calls, thankfully. But ultimately, Neil tells you, let's just stop that. So with that historical view in mind, let's take a look at the current two-factor, or what I should say is the authentication landscape. And what you'll see here is, you know about the three types of factors. There's what you know, which is your password or your PIN, what you have, and then something you are, or how, and some people have argued that behavioral should be a fourth category. I put it kind of in the biometric signature category. That's fertile ground for discussion and certainly not a critical issue in this talk. What's interesting to me is, number one, when they say two-factor authentication has been defeated, did they defeat all of them? They got close. Out of all those methods, all the ones in red have at least some known vulnerability to them. And some of them may be inherent to the design, like SMS, but some of them may be, hey, these need to change. Like even smart cards have a vulnerability about local caching. But they're still considered the gold standard when it comes to authentication. So, and this list by no means is exhaustive. If there's ones that I should add on there, by all means, reach out to me. I would love to include it. I'm hoping to translate this into a paper eventually in my infinite spare time. So, what do we do about all this information? And we're going to look at this through a couple of questions. The first one is, how effective is two-factor authentication already? Now, as I've seen through the Twitter feed for DerbyCon and through Jason's talk, when an attacker says that they hate a control, that means it's a good thing, right? I'm going to take that as a yes. But Javelin, we'll talk about the Javelin study, Google. Discuss briefly the fact that throughout history, technology will always develop weaknesses because people are always trying to innovate. And honestly, the biggest threat to two-factor authentication is how good is your account recovery. Because if an email can bypass your two-factor authentication, it's not really that strong. And unfortunately, a lot of vendors who have implemented even security key-based authentication, you can recover your account with an email. That's a problem. So let's take a look at Javelin. This was a study. Javelin is a research firm commissioned by FIDO. So you kind of look at that and you say, okay, fox guarding the hen house. But what they were really trying to examine was what the rate of adoption was for cryptographically stronger methods of authentication. And they did note some good findings. It's increased threefold for consumers, and it's increased almost 50% for enterprises. So that's certainly encouraging. From what I've seen, and FIDO certainly, or rather Javelin confirms this, PSD2 has been probably the biggest driver behind two-factor adoption. GDPR certainly has had an impact as well. The one thing I would have loved to have seen out of this study, and it's true of the Google study as well, is what was their account takeover rate before two-factor was enabled? Because to me, from a scientific method perspective, you want to do the before and after, right? So with respect to the Google study, and I apologize, this might be a little hard to read, but the bars will kind of give you a sense of what the effectiveness is. What they found was, and these are pretty stunning. You see the knowledge-based challenges on the right. So this is the classic knowledge-based authentication. If I can't figure out my password, what was your mother's maiden name, where was your father born, all stuff that can be very easily socially engineered. And you can see the account takeover rate is even that's kind of good. So it's not horrible, but it's certainly not as good as what you see on the left, where for device-based challenges, if they're either using an on-device prompt, like in the case of Google, you could send a push notification to the Google app itself. Even an SMS code for broad spectrum attacks, it was 100% effective. So, yes, that's their claim. 100% is good. Even if that number is a little off, again, and I suspect the audience kind of shares this opinion, SMS is always going to be better than no two-factor at all. But one of the things that impressed me was even in the SMS space, even a highly targeted attack, you still wound up with a 74% prevention rate. That's pretty good. So when we go back to the Modlishka discussion, and don't get me wrong, Modlishka was, number one, it's a pen tester's dream because it's very easy to set up, it's easy to automate, and that's what it was originally designed for, but we know hackers are going to get a hold of it, and so it can become a weapon against users. But if these tools are that effective, how much panic do we apply to what happened with the release of this toolkit? And what was obviously also noteworthy was the 100% success rate for all three attack methods when it came to using a security key. Now, again, this is Google. I would love to see what their ATO rate was prior to the study, especially before they did Beyond Trust, or not Beyond Trust, their Zero Trust initiative. So I found this quote, and I thought it was pretty useful. I'm not going to read it to you, but basically not using 2FA is far more damaging than using one that has some flaws with it. Now, that may vary in your enterprise in terms of what your risk is. I work for a pharmaceutical company where we have some fairly sensitive intellectual property. So there's going to be some areas where I want the highest controls possible to prevent data leakage. However, I also have functions where I get read access to reports on infrastructure. How much of a level of control do I need there? Ultimately, attackers will always find a way, even with the newest standard. And I didn't really talk about FIDO 2 at the beginning when I was talking about the profiles, but FIDO 2 combined with web authentication, I think is pretty exciting. And I think has an opportunity to, and this is not a pitch for them, I'm not a member of FIDO, but I think it has the opportunity to really improve broad spectrum use of security, not just security keys, but letting your phone become a much stronger authenticator than just simply receiving a text message. So where do we go from here? Well, first, as I've reiterated a number of times, let risk be your guide. Look at the assets within your organization and don't necessarily think of a single method of two-factor authentication for your users. At Merck, we have 3 different methods. Obviously, I'm not going to tell you what they all are. Maybe over a beer, a bourbon, actually. But don't necessarily think in terms of a silver bullet, and that's what a lot of the vendors will try and sell you. Use this, your problem solved. The other piece that I would like to couple with this, and this is still an emerging capability in the markets, is the ability to apply risk in real time to your authentication transaction. We do that a little bit today. The banks are better at it, where if all of a sudden I show up in Prague 7 hours from now, so I've broken, time speed barriers, they're going to go, hey, I'm going to put your card on hold for a minute while you try and buy that cheeseburger. I've been surprised at the number of burgers they sell in Prague. I don't know why that is, but it's a favorite thing. But instead, consider a buffet of options on that. And then finally, as you get vulnerabilities, do 3 things. First of all, obviously, next, collaborate. I only throw ID Pro up here for a shameless promotion, but obviously there's other organizations, there's other peers. Being at this conference is an opportunity to collaborate with people and talk about what these threats are. And you thought I was going to say, listen, Vanilla Ice was last year, right? Do your research and do research with other people. Find out what that's going to look like. Also, some sage advice from April Wright. This happened a few days ago. Basically, just put your effort in your controls where they belong. Understand what your risk is. So, in summary, ultimately, we talked about letting risk be your guide. I'm having trouble reading this. Apologies on the colors. As vulnerabilities emerge, do what we just talked about. Technology will always gain vulnerabilities. History proves this. That's why we have teams on both sides. For enterprises, and I know Jason talked about this a little bit in his talk, embrace 2FA internally. And I've been surprised as I've surveyed my peers, the number of enterprises that don't adopt 2FA internally. That just has to change. The old saying, the perimeter is gone, has been true for probably about a decade now. For consumers, you add 2FA where you can, but also create solid recovery alternatives if they offer it. And then finally, I would encourage us to consider killing the 2 in 2FA. If web authentication and FIDO2 can achieve the level that it needs, that could become your primary method. You have backup methods, but not all methods are required at the time of authentication. I think we can get there pretty quickly. This is the other version of killing passwords, and I think we're a lot closer there than we realize. And as I mentioned, those are the resources. I will be publishing those, and I'd be happy to entertain any questions. I think we only have like a minute or 2. Or 2. Yes. Like I said, I will be publishing these on SlideShare, so you're welcome to them. Yes, sir.
What can we do to improve our recovery process? So a lot of the issue is that we use all these cloud services which are free and automated, and to make it convenient, we have to sacrifice something.
Yeah.
So have you thought through have any proposals on how we could address that?
The short version of that answer is create more authenticators. For example, for any account that the technology vendor allows it, I have multiple keys assigned to it, so that if I lose one YubiKey, I have a backup YubiKey to do that. Because those backup account recovery processes are inherently weak, and any social engineer will be able to get past them. Any other questions? Well, thank you all very much.